In this one, we'll be building this simple to-do app in React. We've actually created this before in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And if you compare the two, you will see how easy it is to create this in React. You can check and delete items from here. And of course, you can add new ones, just like this. This is a nice project for beginners to practice. So let's get started. Alright, so without us going any further, I have a folder open here where I'll create my project. I've opened up the terminal and I'll type here npm create wheat at latest. Now you have to give a project name. This is up to you, but I'll give React to do app. Next, you choose your framework, which is obviously going to be React. And then I won't be using TypeScript for this project, so we'll simply go with JavaScript. You then run the top two commands. And now that that's done, a folder has been created with our files in it, so I just open it up in Visual Studio Code. Now I can open a terminal here and type npm run dev. And now our basic React project is set up. This is the basic boilerplate you get. So let's get back to our project. I will hide this terminal for now. The first thing that I'd like to do is clean up our project. So I'll come to our index.css, Ctrl A and delete everything. Same with our app.css, delete everything. And same with our app.jsx, delete everything, and call refc here. This is an extension that you can have a look at. It's ESLint snippets for React. This is the component that lets you use refc. And now, since the focus of this video is not the actual CSS, I will just copy paste those in. This goes into our index.css. This is our basic styling. And now we'll start working on our to-do list by creating a new folder here called components. And inside that, create another folder called TodoList. Inside this component, I've created our CSS. You can have a look at this from the source code. These are just some predefined values to make it responsive and make it look good. And now we'll also create our TodoList.jsx in here. Call refc. And now I reorganize the window so we can see our to-do list as well. In our app.jsx, I'll simply import the to-do list from the components /todolist/todolist.jsx and then render it here instead of this div, just like this. And now I'll go back to our to-do list and I'll import our CSS by saying import ./todolist.css. So I've inserted some HTML here. This is just some basic HTML, nothing to worry about. And we'll be expanding this with React features so we can make our to-do list functional. But before we put any functionality into this, let's create the skeleton further. So I'd like to create the to-do item, which will be rendered over here in the UL. Inside the components folder, I'll create a new folder called TodoItem. Inside that, we'll create our TodoItem.css, which again is just some basic CSS. You can have a look at it in the source code. And I will also be creating the TodoItem.jsx here. Call refc and import ./TodoItem.css. This will apply our CSS to this element. I've also inserted some HTML into here. Nothing too crazy. There is a button for checking it, a title, and a delete button. That's all we'd like for this component to have. And I've also imported a checker PNG from our assets. So in our assets, I have this checker.png. You can get any type of PNG from Google. Just make sure to have something to display over there. And now we'll come to the to-do list, and where we say render the items here, I simply render hard-coded some to-do items. This will import the to-do item, and I can put multiple of these in here, and there will be multiple of these to-do items. So let's go from the inside out, and first I'd like to work on the to-do item so we can actually check the items and we can put a line through them. This will be with some dynamic CSS. To check whether it's complete or not, so whether it's checked in or not, I create a new UseState. It will be called isChecked and setChecked. If you're not familiar with UseState, UseState is basically a hook in React that lets you render the component whenever a certain value changes. And I'd like the isComplete to be false by default. So if isChecked changes, then our component will re-render and it will tell React that we should display the check image or we shouldn't display the check image. And to display that image, we have to click this button. So I refer to the onClick event of this button, and inside that I pass in an arrow function, and this arrow function will call the setChecked, and we'll set the checked to be the opposite of isChecked. This won't show us anything in the UI, but it will in the background determine if this bool is true or false. There are some styles in our CSS that if you check out, we have to manually apply. If we want to dynamically apply those classes, I have to wrap the class name in curly braces, and then inside that I can start writing custom logic. For example, I put a space in here, and I can say plus, just like we would when we are concatenating some strings, then parentheses, and we are checking with the ternary operator if isChecked. So if the icon should be there, we'll give the active class, and otherwise, if it's not checked, we won't give any classes dynamically. The same will apply for the style of the button, but this time, since we are using the style, put double curly braces in here, and we can refer to the background image of the component. And here, the same applies. We can use the ternary operator to say if isChecked, then whatever's coming after the question mark is what happens if we are checked. And if we are checked, then we'll be saying URL, which is the same as if I would type it out in CSS, and the URL will be the checker image. The checker image, remember, is what we've imported from the assets. Otherwise, if we are not checked, we wouldn't like for it to have a background image, so I just put an empty string in here. This should work with any image that you are setting. And if I have a look now and click this title here, it's now checked, and I can also remove it. It's working dynamically exactly as we wanted it to do. I'll be copying this style over to our title, but here instead of setting background image dynamically, I will say text decoration, and if we are checked, then the text decoration should be line through, which is a basic CSS property for putting a line through it, just like it's updated in our UI right now. Otherwise, we wouldn't like it to be anything. And if I remove the tick, then the line goes away, and this is also working dynamically. Now all we have left is the deletion, but that deletion will be left to the end of the video because we need the to-do list to be functional before we can actually delete anything from this. So let's jump on to our to-do list.jsx and work there. What I'd like to do now in our to-do list component is to dynamically render our to-do items, so we don't have to copy-paste these all over again, and we can have, for example, a database that we call it from. Obviously, we won't have one, we'll be working with dummy data, but if you want to have a more robust step, this solution will allow you to do that. So I delete the elements from here and actually insert some starting data. This starting data is going to be our dummy data. You could actually fetch this from a database if you have one. And each task is going to have a title, and they are going to have an ID, and a robust way to assign IDs is using the date.now. And whenever you're adding dynamically data, there will be no two elements with the same date.now, but since we're starting with the dummy data, I explicitly say +1, +2, +3 to each of these, because if we would start our app and each of them would be date.now, then we would have the same date.now in this dummy data at every start of our app, which is not something that we'd like to do. And now I'll create a use state for this. This state will be current items and set current items. And of course it will be equal to the use state. And then the starting data will be passed into this use state. But we can later add more elements and we'll be setting the current items with those. For now, let's just render our elements dynamically. So in the URL, I will open curly braces here and say the elements that I'd like to render here will be the current items dot map, and then this will receive an arrow function. I will refer to each of the items in the current items as item. You can name this whatever you'd like. Then parentheses, and I'll just simply say render the TodoItem over here. When mapping something in React, this will go over the items and pick up the data, and for each element that's in the current items, a new TodoItem will be rendered. But I'd like to implement the data, so to incorporate the data to our TodoItems, we need props to be passed into that item. And not only that, but when you're mapping the data, there is a property or an attribute called key, which is mandatory to set in React, otherwise it will keep throwing you errors. And that key, we deliberately created item.id for this one. This will make sure that the dynamically rendered elements can be distinguished. And now I'll jump back to our TodoItem and create the props that need to be passed in. Here as the prop, I'll destructure the parameters. You could also say just prop and I refer to them as prop dot whatever it is, but the destruction way is much cleaner. Destructuring them, I will want first of all an isComplete variable. This isComplete will be an optional variable. I can manually set this so that the check appears instantly. And to incorporate this into the item, I will set the isComplete to be the starting element of the isChecked. This is just a little detour from the functionality. And then I'd like to pass in children here. This is something special in React because if I say children instead of the title, if I pass something in like I would, for example, into an h1 element, but this time into a TodoItem, that will get rendered as text. You'll see it in a minute. And then we also pass in the ID. And while we're at it, I'll also pass in something called the delete callback function, which I'll be explaining later. For now, all we have to implement is this children here, and that I set the isComplete to be the default here instead of just simply hardcoding false. Now if I come back to the TodoItem, I can actually render here as the children in curly braces item.title. Now each of the titles are changed, so we've successfully rendered our data dynamically. Now what I'd like to do is for us to be able to add elements, because right now that's not functional, and then to delete those elements. For that to happen, I'll create a new UseState variable, maybe below our current items, and I name it new item title. And of course there comes its pair set new item title. This will be equal to the UseState, and the new item title will be an empty string by default. This will be required because we will update the value of this when the user types into the input field. So to set up our input field, I'll come here, and the value of the input field, which is what is typed into the input field, will be equal to the new item title. So we've changed it up one way, but that's not enough because this won't actually set the value of the new item title. The new item title will set the value of our input value, if that's somehow understandable. But the main thing is that we have to put an onChange here because we have to bind it in two ways. This will receive an arrow function with an event object, and here we can set the new item title. So I call this set new item title, and then e.target.value. With this setup, take note of this. This is how you chain up inputs fields with the UseState. I can actually access the new item title now with whatever's inputted into that field. So let's create two functions now. I'd like to create a function for adding an item, add item. It will receive a new item. This will be the name of the prop, and it will be an object just like in our dummy data. And I'll say set current items, and here we'll set the current items to be a new array. And this new array, we use the spread operator for the current items. This means it will put each element in the current items to the beginning of the array. So whatever was there, it gets copied over, and then to the end of the array, we put the new item that's passed in as a prop. I'll copy this and call this delete item because while we're at it, we need something to delete these, and the prop will be called item to delete, and we will yet again set the current items, but instead of setting them to an array like this, we set it to the current items.filter. Filter is very much like the map function. It goes over all the elements of the array, and then on a condition, it will include certain items into it. For example, it will receive the item just like the map did. So we refer to the current item, for example, index 0 item, index 1 item as item. And then I only want to include the item here, which has an ID that's not equal to the item to delete.id. So this function essentially what it does is it receives an item that it wants to delete from our array. It goes over all the items, and if the item.id is not equal to the deletion item.id, then we include that item into our current item, so that item can stay. But if the ID is the same as the one we'd like to delete, then we don't include that in our current items. Now let's work on the button that's actually submitting the data to add items. So when we click this item, I pass in an arrow function in here, then we have to call add item. But what type of item do we add into it? For that I create a new constant item. It will be called new item. And it will be an object where I set the title, and whatever the input field has, we've already defined with the new item title. And I'll also set the ID of it to be date.now. This will put a timestamp in here that is always referred to the current date at which they are pressing the button, which is good for us. And then in the add item, I will say add the new item. And also, in addition, what I'd like to use is set the new item title to be an empty one, so that after the new item is added, the form resets. Now this is great, but I can actually submit this while it's being empty. Or if I put in here multiple spaces, I can still submit it, and it just gets filled up with all these empty tasks, which is of course not ideal. So to avoid that, I will create a new constant variable here for checking if the item has spaces in it. Trimmed title will be equal to the new item title.trim. This will remove the leading and trailing white spaces, so the user won't be permitted to enter only white spaces. And we are checking if the trimmed title is not basically null, so it exists. Then we create this new item, and only then, do we add this whole thing in here. So only add the item and only set the title back if it's not just pure spaces. And instead of saying the title to be new item title, I say trimmed title. This should prevent us from entering spaces, but that's not enough, because we still need to signal to the user that while the button is disabled, you should enter something there. So I can set the disabled property in curly braces to be not new item title dot trim. This will mean that if the form or the new item title is empty, then the button will be disabled. And as you see, it's right now disabled. Even if I enter spaces in here, the trim will remove those spaces, which will still result in an empty string, which will set the disabled to be true. So I'll just say as or whatever I'd like, and then it's now available to be added. Now working on the delete function is going to be a little bit different, because we'll be using something called a callback function to pass in when we are deleting something, and execute that callback function to signal to our parent component, basically the TodoList component, that something needs to be deleted. Obviously, the deletion would come from an onClick event in the TodoItem, and that onClick event will call the delete callback function. And this delete callback function will receive the ID, because this is just a placeholder for the function that we want to execute. So we are passing in whatever function we are passing in here, and it will receive the ID of the object. And that ID, of course, has to be set as a prop in our TodoItem. And luckily, we have something that we can refer to, which will be the item.id. And we'll be passing in this delete item function. And just now I realized I made a mistake here, because we are passing in an ID to the item to delete. So it's actually just an ID, not the whole item that is an object format like this. So we don't have to refer to its ID. I can just safely remove this. And in the callback, if I come here and refer to the delete callback, I can pass in the delete item function. Now, in the beginning, it was a little bit tough to wrap my head around this. So let's go over this once again. We are passing in a function into the TodoItem. Whatever function it is, it doesn't matter, it's just a function. And that the TodoItem receives this function as a prop, and it calls it with whatever props they are passed in. This is just a substitute. I could pass in here the add item or any other custom items. It doesn't matter, it's just a placeholder name, and it passes in something. And then it gets executed. But what matters here is that it passes in the ID, and that this function that's passed in is executed when this button is clicked. In other frameworks, this would work with dispatching custom events, but unfortunately in React it's not accessible. So this is how we have to go around with this, using a callback function. We are passing in a function that needs to be called at a certain time or at a certain event in a certain component. And when it's triggered, it simply deletes the item in this scenario. So if the checking of course still works, and I can delete this from here, delete, 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 delete. Our to-do list is basically working and it's fully functional. I can add the listing here, check it, delete it. It's all there. So with that, we've gone through much of the basic functionalities that we could in this to-do app. I hope you enjoyed it, found value in it. And if something was not understandable, you can always have a look at the source code. It will be in the description down below, or you can comment us down below what you didn't understand and we'll be happy to help you out. If you enjoyed it, please consider giving us a like, maybe even subscribe. And other than that, I hope to see you in the next one. Happy coding and God bless.